Hey guys, it's Amanda Maid, and today we are updating my January reading journal. I can't believe the time has come. Anyway, I am so excited to break this in and fill it in with all my reads from January, and I wanted to make sure that this journal was the most magical journal possible. So in today's video, we're going to do some book updates, but we're also going to play with some arts and crafts. We're going to do some different gold foiling techniques, pull out the watercolors, and celebrate all of the awesome books and worlds we visited in January. So pull out some supplies, let's craft together, and I hope you enjoy this video.
So I'm a sucker for anything that has this pretty gold foiling kind of design on it. And I wondered, how can we achieve this in our own reading journals? So I'm pulling out a couple supplies that I just had laying around. We've got some gold gel pens, a embossing set, and also a heated quill, which works really well with gold foil. So I'm going to test out these techniques and see which one works well for my reading journal in hopes of adding a little bit more magic to my designs. So let's get into what I read in January, starting with the cover page. This month I participated in 2 readathons. We started our adventure in Aldea, which is a year-long fantasy D&D style readathon hosted by Book Roast. And I also participated in Winterween, hosted by Gabby Reads. This is a week-long readathon. I read 2 books for that readathon that covered all 5 prompts. I also rebound my first softcover to hardcover, and of course participated in all the hype surrounding Onyx Storm. So it was a full month of bookish activities. And on the right, I'm just going to make a simple spread for January, which includes some paper scraps and some stickers. And like everything in this video, I will link whatever supplies I have links for in the description. Before we actually stick some papers down, I need to do something that I've committed to do for the rest of this journal, and that is distressing the edges. So here I'm just peeling off the final row of the page and distressing it with this ink set, which is really simple. All you do is kind of rub this stamp around the edges and it gives it kind of a weathered and worn look. And this is just to carry through that piratey theme throughout the rest of my journal. I've used the same stamp to kind of distress the borders of the paper too, just so the background doesn't feel so stark white. Then I can begin to lay things down. I hope you guys all had a great January. Usually, January is my month. I love setting up new routines and habits and just that fresh start feeling. But unfortunately, I was pretty much knocked out by the flu, and January is a big blur. I was sick for about 2 weeks, and then right after that, some pretty crazy forest fires started in Southern California near my house, and it was a pretty scary week for a lot of people in the Los Angeles area. And I'm just so thankful that my loved ones are safe and that the fires are finally out. So, somehow, in all of that chaos, I still managed to read 10 books in January, and many of them were quite good, and I'm excited for today's spreads. If you watched my previous video, you've already gotten a little preview of what I've read in January because I went over my January reads and made updates to some of the annual trackers and challenges that I had previously made because there was a couple corrections that needed to happen before I could move on with this journal. So if you haven't caught that yet, it's a fun video, and now I think I'm set for the rest of the year. But for my January cover page, I'm just going to keep it real simple using different stickers that I had that fit the January mood. Of course, I had to include Indarna on here, my little gold dragon, and these lovely bow stickers. I felt were very wintry, but not necessarily too Christmassy. So I liked how it all turned out in the end. And now let's get into our reading spreads. The first spread I want to make is an homage to the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. I snagged one of the beautiful UK covers and want to replicate that in watercolor in my journal. Now, I am not a watercolor master, so I'll be using this drawing gum to preserve the places on the page that I want to remain white. That way I can get a little sloppier with my paint, and I'm hoping the end result will sort of look like watercolory stained glass in all of these different windows here. Honestly, the toughest part of this spread was just drawing out everything, but it wasn't too challenging considering all of these shapes are rectangles with maybe an arched top. So I drew in a couple details like the fox and a flower, but pretty much everything else is a pretty generic shape, just laid out in a pretty order. So I think it's pretty doable to replicate if you guys wanted to try something like this in your journal. I think the end result is really cool and definitely worth the time it took to sketch it out. Anyway, I'm just going around with my drawing gum and painting over anything that I want to remain white or anything that I don't want to be affected by the messiness of the original watercolor layer that I'm putting down. So things like the center of the sun, flowers, the bow, little stars, I want to preserve so they don't get messy and later can stand out a little bit better. This is a very cool product because it's very easy to paint on and it dries very quickly. Once it dries, it has kind of a sticky layer to it, similar to the back of a post-it note. And after you're finished painting, you can just rub it right off and it protects the paper that's underneath it. So it's quite a cool product, and I kind of forgotten about it for a long time. I used it back in art school and saw it recently at an art store, so I picked it up and wanted to play with it again. While that's drying, I'm going to use this washi tape on the opposite page from the Quirky Cup Collective because I thought it had that stained glass element that corresponded really well with the spread on the other side. So I'm just layering this down to give this side of the page some visual contrast and leaving the rest of it open for my book reviews. These were the two books that we chose for our book clubs in January. One is Hello Beautiful by Anne Napolitano. This book is so highly rated on Goodreads, and I was very excited to read it because it's pitched as a Little Women retelling, which is one of my favorite stories. But unfortunately, I really did not like this book. I gave it 2 stars. I thought for a book with such a dramatic story, the characters had no emotion, and I felt just very disconnected, and my book club kind of felt the same. I made these little icons to indicate which of the books in my journal were for book club, and because I'm in 2 book clubs, I made these icons in 2 different shades of this sagey green and just pasting those in the corners so I remember which books each month were part of those clubs. The other book we read was Big Summer by Jennifer Weiner, and this book surprised me. I thought it was going to be a fluffy, cheesy romance novel, but instead we got a thriller, a little bit of a mystery. So it was much better than I expected, and I would say I still give it a 3 stars. It was still kind of meh for me. But it's also just not my typical genre, and I liked it a lot more than I expected to like it. But essentially, you're dealing with some frenemies, some best friends that have some beef with each other that are trying to rekindle their friendship over the setting up a wedding. And things get complicated, other people get involved and shake things up. And the story goes in a completely different direction than what I was expecting. But my whole book club ended up enjoying it, and it was a nice change of pace to some of the heavier books we had read in previous months, and also provided a good segue to a spicy romance that we were reading in February. So I love this book club for all of the variety of reads it brings, and it really stretches me to pick things up that I normally wouldn't touch. So I'm glad that I experienced that book. Jumping back to my watercolor project, again, I am not a master. I am simply having fun and playing around with these colors. What I am doing though is taking that color and pulling it into a different part of the page so that eventually when the painting is finished, I'll have the same colors kind of blended in throughout. I also enjoy the sloppy effect of these colors, which is why I'm layering and mixing a bunch of those colors together to give the glass a little bit more dimension. But again, not a master. I'm sure there is a prettier way to do all of this. At this point, I'm just having fun and trusting the process. And only hope that this painting is somewhat reminiscent of the beautiful covers of the series. I had a lot of fun playing with these watercolors and encourage you to dig deep in your crafty drawers and pull out something that you used to love that you want to practice in, because at this point I just kind of want to watercolor everything. Once I let all of my paint dry, it was time to peel away that drawing gum. And all you do for this is rub your finger along it and it kind of pulls away like, again, the back of a post-it note. I did have a couple areas on the page that tore a tiny bit, but everything was fixable. And I think those areas were still a little bit wet from the watercolor because I didn't give it quite enough time to dry. But what can I say? I wanted to see the end result, and peeling all of that away was so satisfying. Now that these different white elements are exposed again, I can go in and paint them in a more vibrant layer of watercolor. All of these symbols within these windows are representations within the story. So if you're not familiar with the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy, don't worry, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but there's a story within a story called The Ballad of the Archer and the Fox, and it plays an important role in the story overall. I thought the series was super cute, and I'm glad to have such a large display in my reading journal to think back on it. Finally, I'm just filling in these edges with a grayish blue backdrop, and then I'll take a black micron pen and outline this design. This is the part that is really going to pull it together and make it go from kind of a sloppy watercolor to something that looks more precise and intentional. This also brings us to our first gold foiling technique, which is gold gel pens. I tested out 3 different pens, but settled on the Uniball Signo Broad in gold. This pen had the boldest line, so I thought it would work really well as the metallic caming in these stained glass windows. Caming is the part of the window that separates each piece of glass. So I'm just using that to add a little bit of dimension to each of the stained glass windows, kind of outlining parts of the window, but then leaving that black line as a stronger border around the more prominent details within the windows. I like this gel pen too because it has more of a yellow gold to it, so it fit with this color scheme overall. But if you are looking for something more white gold, I would go with the Gellyroll Metallic by Sakura. The Once Upon a Broken Heart series is 3 books, and they're set in a fairy tale world with curses and fate and true love and vampires and fairies and balls and princesses and everything you could want in a fairy tale. I thought this series was charming and would probably read this one again. I did think that the first book was the strongest of the 3, but I enjoyed my time throughout the whole series, and we already know that I love the book covers so much. The book cover also had these pretty cherry blossoms on it, and so I decided to use these cherry blossom stickers since I already had them, and I think it gave the spread a nice finishing touch, still leaving room for my book review to be written in later. bringing us to my favorite read of the month and my biggest surprise as well, and that is The Bone Houses by Emily Lloyd Jones. This has been on my shelves for a couple years after finding it at a thrift store and purchasing because it was $1 and it had a skeleton on the cover. So after being ignored on my TBR shelf for several years, I finally picked it up to fulfill the prompts for the Winterween readathon. This year, the prompts were to read a book in the dark or at night, check. Read a horror or a thriller, check. Read a book with house on the cover or in the title, check. Read a horror book published 5 or more years ago, check. And to read a novella, manga, or listen to a spooky audiobook. And this book understood the assignment. So to make a magical spread for the most magical book, we're going to use a gold foil quill. This tool I found at Michael's, and essentially you are burning gold foil into a page with a heated pen. To set this up, you'll need to cut out some of this gold transfer foil, which comes with the pen tool, and tape it onto your paper, trying to get it as straight and even as possible. Now, ideally, you can just use your pen to draw on the foil directly, and it will transfer that color over to the page. But because this design is very detailed, I want to trace it. So I printed out a black and white picture on the thinnest paper I had, and I'm taping that over the gold foil design so that I can just use the pen right on top of the printed paper and hope that it goes through. This pen tool plugs into a USB port, and you just need to allow it to heat up. So I gave it about 10 minutes to let it heat, and just make sure you're not touching that tip because it does get very hot. Now this is the tricky part because with this technique you can't really see where you've been before. You're just pressing in that foil onto the page, and you need to have enough pressure and heat for that foil to fully transfer over. So for tracing purposes, I'm only focusing on the important parts of the design. So I'm going over each of the letters so I get the correct placement. I also want to go around the teeth because I think that is probably the most important part of the face feature. And then I also want to go around the overall outline of the skull so that I can get the proportion correct. But beyond that, I'm going to do my best to freehand the swirly parts of the image because otherwise there's no way I would know where I was leaving off. So this is what it looks like once I've outlined the most important parts on the page. You can kind of see where the foil has already been transferred over and where I still need to fill in. So now I can go back and freehand the rest of it by just kind of looking at my picture as a reference. I also want to make sure that the image that I previously traced fully did transfer over, so I'm going over all of those areas first to make sure that they have gotten enough heat to make the complete transfer. And this is what it looks like about an hour later after I've doodled a ton. So the satisfying part is peeling this away and seeing what is left underneath. And you can see you're left with a beautiful reflective gold foil. And it doesn't rub off, but it certainly catches the light and looks really magical. Up next is just to fill in the lettering and also fill in a couple of the gaps left where the gold foil didn't quite transfer. So I'm just taking a tiny slip of that foil and freehanding some swirls to fill in those little spaces that didn't get enough foil previously. And this is the end result. I absolutely love it, and I loved the book as well. So for my book review page, I am just choosing some of my favorite stationery, something that complemented the book covers. Because I love the Bone Houses so much, I also had to read The Drowned Woods, also by Emily Lloyd Jones, set in the same world. The Bone Houses is about a girl named Rin. She's a young adult, and she must save her family and home from the Bone Houses, which are these undead skeletons that live in the woods. She is partnered with Ellis, who is a map maker and stranger to her town, but he goes on this adventure with her to also discover kind of his own lineage. I really love that the main characters are connected by their differences. I loved the strong family element. Rin is a big sister, and her whole family is very, very close. I loved the little goat character. That was very fun, and I just couldn't put it down. The writing was incredible. Absolutely was in love with it. Drowned Woods was also good. It didn't captivate me as much as The Bone Houses, but this book is about a mermaid who is set in the same world, and she is kind of set on revenge. So she goes on a quest to break a spell within the kingdom. Like I said, it was good. I didn't feel as connected to the characters in this story as the Bone Houses, but if you like stories that band together a bunch of misfits, this would be a good read for you. Another one of my favorite stories that I read this month was Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. And once again, for this spread, I'm going to be recreating the gorgeous book cover. I feel like I could draw a swan. I could paint that with watercolor, right? Like it's a swirl, it's an S. So I'm breaking out my watercolors again, and we're going to kind of recreate this cover. In terms of writing, Once Upon a River is truly one of the strongest books that I've ever read. Diane Setterfield takes a bunch of different stories and layers them together to create one overarching story. So in the beginning of the book, it's a little bit jarring because you're jumping from all of these different perspectives and people, and it doesn't feel like anything is connected. But as you continue on in the story, all of these pieces come together. The story starts with a stranger bursting into an inn holding a drowning girl. And miraculously, both the stranger and the girl are saved. But no one at the inn knows who this child belongs to. And after word gets out, 3 separate families step forward claiming that the child is part of their family. So the story is a mystery to figure out where this child truly belongs. It's a lot of digging up family secrets, and it's done in an interesting way because each chapter is told from the perspective of a different character, which in the beginning can be a little tough to keep straight, but once you are immersed into the story, it makes sense and the story comes together so beautifully. I also really appreciated that there was disability representation in this book. One of our characters has Down syndrome, and he is given the unique ability to understand our mysterious child in a way that no one else does and no one else can. And I thought that was a very beautiful sentiment. The audiobook narration by Juliet Stevenson was stunning. I loved all of her different character voices, and there were so many characters that she had to make voices for. And wow, she did a beautiful job, and I think that made the writing stand out all the more. All right, back to the spread. I'm using this floral washi tape in the background and just using my scissors to trim around the outline of the swan before we get into our next technique, which is using gold embossing powder. And I'm going to show that to you in 2 different ways. So I'm going to use this stamp set to recreate the lettering that goes along the swan's neck on the book cover. And we're going to emboss this with an embossing tool. So all you need for this is stamps, and I'm using this Versamark watermark stamp pad, which is like a sticky ink pad. And then you also need embossing powder, in which I chose gold. So first I pull out all the letters that I need for the spread, and then I'm going to use that ink pad to transfer our letters over. Now it's a little different than traditional stamping because you can't see any color left over once you stamp the letter down, unless you hold it up to the light and kind of see that watermark or gleam. But it's just sticky enough for our embossing powder to stick to it later on. And it's a very easy fix just in case it gets a little messy, which trust me, it will. Next is the fun part. You get to shake the embossing powder all over your design, and as you spread it around, it's going to stick to the stamps that you previously set up. So I'm just lightly pushing this around with my finger. You can also kind of shake the paper so that it lands on those areas. And then you just shake it off onto a scrap piece of paper by tapping it against the table. And the nice thing too is you can use all of that runoff again just by putting it back into that little jar. Then I'm just taking a small paintbrush and brushing away any excess powder that I don't want around. Some of the letters came out very clear, but a couple letters that I had to stamp a few times to get them in the right position left me with too much powder in that area. So again, just brushing it around, clearing up those edges so that when it's time to use the heat gun, it gives us the shape that we want to keep there. Anything else that I brush away won't stay on my page. You'll also notice that the powder looks a little bit more tan than gold, and that's because it hasn't been activated by the heat gun yet. So now comes the fun part. We get to hold the heat gun up against the letters, and I'll show you as the letters kind of change color. This powder is these little metallic pieces that, when exposed to heat, will turn into foil. So you can see how the color changes and turns from powder into like a metallic finish as I hold heat to it. It's so cool and it's so satisfying. Really, the only downside to this method is the fact that you're left with a page that is slightly curly. I think something happens during the foil process that causes the paper to shrink within it. So it does make the page a little bit wavy, but I think for the sake of a journal, it's going to be fine and it's going to straighten itself out once it's on the shelf for a while. And lastly, I'm just putting some finishing touches along the border of the swan so that I can separate the outline with where I'm going to write in my book review, and then pasting in the photo of the book cover. So even though I'm using this 2-page spread to talk about multiple books, I want both pages to look nice next to each other. So I'm finishing off this edge here with a neutral piece of washi tape that has some handwriting on it. And I will also use the same daisy washi tape to create kind of a border, similar to how I did on the first spread. I read a lot of books in a year, and I don't think I would ever finish my journal if I tried to make a full page spread for every single book. So instead, I like to showcase the books that I really loved and just write a quick review for the books that were just okay. So this month I had 2 3-star books, one of which was The Vanishing Bookstore by Helen Pfeiffer, and the other was The Spell Shop by Sarah Beth Durst. And those had a similar color scheme to their book covers as did Once Upon a River, so I thought they would complement each other on this 2-page spread. I was selected to read an early copy of The Vanishing Bookstore, which blends the generational mystery of Wayward with the familial bonds of practical magic. It has a family curse, nature spells, secrets, hidden books, and fated loves, and contains all of the essential elements for a magical read. I really enjoyed the mystery part of the book. I thought the plot and the characters were compelling enough to keep me entertained, um, but at times it was also a little bit silly and cozy, which was not the mood that I was in for this book. and I don't know how well it blended with the high stakes mystery element of the book. For me, it was very reminiscent of Practical Magic. So if you loved that book and Alice Hoffman's writing, I really think you will enjoy The Vanishing Bookstore, but it wasn't a personal favorite of mine. Which brings us to The Spell Shop, which is another cozy fantasy read. I was hoping that this one would feel more like Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, but it didn't have the same charm for me as that book did. I did, however, really like the element of mercy shown to our villain at certain points in this book that I don't think you see so often in mainstream media, so I appreciated that. Finally, bringing us to our spread for Onyx Storm. Again, I want to use the book cover as my inspiration for this spread, so I drew it out in pencil on a black piece of construction paper. And the easiest way to add those gold foil elements would be to use a gel pen, but I wanted to show you how to use that embossing powder in a pen style. So I'm going to be using this Quickie glue pen, which allows me to draw directly on the paper and then add my embossing powder to it. So before I start embossing, I want to first draw in all of my white elements. I'm going to use my white jelly pen to color in the letters of Onyx Storm, and then also wanted to kind of do my own play on the gradient that you see on the book cover, where it goes from black to silver, and use my white pen to color in a small portion of the design on the front cover. The rest of this will be in gold foil, but I think it'll look cool to give that gradient effect to a black piece of paper. The design was a little bit easier to draw out than I expected because it's essentially just a bunch of overlapping squares with a circle in the center and some clouds around. But the details are pretty simple. You have a sun with some straight line beams, you have some dots in the border, and it was surprisingly easy to recreate. The challenge came in tracing over the pencil drawing. Obviously, with the white gel pen, I can see my work really well. It's easy to see where I've drawn before, and it's quite visible on the page. But as you can see with the glue pen, it's kind of hard to see where you're drawing. So I had to keep adding the gold foil powder to the design to remember and see where I had already covered. So I would shake a little bit off, use the pen some more to draw more design, dump a little bit more powder on, shake it off again until I had everything on the design filled in with the gold. Once I had the design complete, I just went in with my paintbrush and cleaned up some of the areas that I had overdrawn. And then the fun part, I could take my heat gun out and actually turn it to foil. Again, this is so satisfying. I love this method. Once that was finished, I just dumped all of the excess powder back into the jar so I could use it later. I've had this jar for so many years and still it has never run out. All right, now let's add our design to our Onyx Storm spread. I wanted to create a Dutch door so that one, it hides my reviews so I don't spoil anything for anybody, but also I thought it would help with that gradient effect of the book cover again. So I'm gluing the page down to a full page in my journal, and then I'm cutting around it again to reinforce it and also to allow a little glimpse of my review to pop through the following page. I'm sure you guys already know what Onyx Storm is about, so I'm not going to be the one to spoil it for you. All I will say is that I really enjoy this series. Yes, there are some editing issues. Yes, the writing and characters can be frustrating a lot of times, but overall, I think the plot is so much fun. I do think that the characters were stronger in this book than they were in Iron Flame and less annoying. So if you are considering whether or not you're continuing this series after Iron Flame, I think you will be pleasantly surprised with Onyx Storm. I think her writing can be a little bit frustrating at times, so I actually opted to listen to the audiobook of this instead of reading it with my eyeballs because I notice that kind of thing less when I'm listening as opposed to looking at the words on a page. While the plot was very different than what I was expecting, I still really enjoyed my time. So I gave it 5 stars for the plot and 2 to 3 stars for the writing. So overall, I'll give Onyx Storm a 4 out of 5 stars. I'm leaving the page on the left blank for now so that I can come back later and paste in some photos of our buddy read. So for now, let's get into the final flip. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you learned something fun and a new technique to make your journals a little bit more magical. Let me know which of the 3 techniques was your favorite and if you've tried any of these before.